An insight into the difference between this way of formulating a law and previous forms will make its nature perfectly clear. If, namely, we look back to the movement of perceiving and to that of the understanding, in which the latter reflects itself into itself and thereby determines its object, we see that the understanding does not in that movement have before itself in its object the relation of these abstract determinations of universal and individual, essential and external. It is itself the transition which does not become objective to it. Here, on the contrary, the organic unity, which is just the relation of those opposites, this relation being a pure transition, is itself the object. This transition in its simplicity is immediately universality, and since this universality explicates the different moments whose relation is to express the law, its moments are universal objects of this consciousness, and the law runs, the outer is the expression of the inner. Here, the understanding has grasped the thought of the law itself, whereas previously it only looked for laws generally, and their moments were only vaguely present to it as a specific content, but not as the thoughts of the laws. As regards content, the laws obtained here ought not to be such as are merely a passive taking up into the form of universality of simply inert differences, but laws which directly possess in these differences the unrest of the notion, and consequently at the same time possess the necessity of the relation between the aspects. But just because the object, the organic unity, directly unites the infinite supersession or absolute negation of being with inert being, and because the moments are essentially a pure transition, there are no such inert aspects as are required for the law. In this paragraph, number 279, it seems as if Hegel is, in certain respects, raising our hopes, giving us perhaps some false hopes that are going to be very quickly disappointed as he moves through this paragraph and then into the following paragraphs. Hegel is still explaining to us why it is that the conception of law that we typically have been working with isn't really adequate to deal with organic beings. And he suggests at this point that we take a look into the difference between this way of formulating a law, the way of formulating a law for organic beings, and the previous forms. And he says this will make its nature perfectly clear. So he says, if we look back to the movement of perceiving, that is perception, wahrnehmung, and the understanding, so that's the force and the understanding section, in which the latter reflects itself back into itself, thereby determines its object. So we have perceiving, perception of the outside world, no longer just sense certainty, but perception of universals, grasping things that are there, right? That moves into understanding, and understanding naturally wants to try to make sense out of not just this particular thing, but the totality, and to make sense of things of that type, to give them laws, and then to have laws that unify other laws. We saw this entire movement in the force and the understanding section. So he says, in this case, the latter reflects itself into itself and thereby determines its object. We see the understanding does not have before itself these things here, right? The relation of these abstract determinations of universal and individual, or essential and external. And that seems kind of a strange thing for Hegel to say, because if we think back to the force and the understanding section, think back to the play of when we had two forces, right? One of which was externalized, one of which was force in itself, right? Or, we have many individuals all being brought under one, we could call it a universal of force. So what is Hegel going on about here? He says that what understanding ends up realizing is that it is itself the transition, which does not then become objective to it. So we saw that this did in fact take place in the force and the understanding section. That understanding after a while started to realize that this whole notion of forces and laws and even worlds, we distinguish these worlds apart from each other that aren't really separated from each other, that the understanding is really what's driving this entire process. And so Hegel will talk here about a transition taking place within it. He says, it is itself the transition which does not become objective to it. So understanding then has to examine itself, and that's when we shifted, you remember, from consciousness into the whole self-consciousness section, right? So if we go on from there, he says, here, on the contrary, the organic unity, right? The organic unity is encompassing all of this, and it's also taking into account these abstract determinations, which are turning out not to be quite so abstract in the organic being. They are the way that it is. He says, here, the organic unity is just the relation of those opposites, this relation being itself a pure transition and being the object. And we saw that the organic being is somewhat different in that it is its own object, right? How is it its own object? Well, in a practical sense, oriented towards action, continuing its being, doing what it needs to do in order to augment its being in relation to other beings and its environment. So this is an important transition point. He says, this is immediately universality, so we can say that this is something that's holding in all these cases. Since its universality explicates the different moments whose relation is to express the law, its moments are universal objects of this consciousness, and the law, notice what law we have here, runs, the outer is the expression of the inner. We have restored, at least for the moment, this law that we have been trying to grapple with and make sense of, right? We saw all sorts of problems with it in the previous paragraphs. Now it looks like Hegel is bringing it back. He's even going to speak more optimistically as we continue in this paragraph with all this talk about law, about now we're not just grasping the content, the inhalt of the law, we're actually grasping the thought of the law. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? He says, here the understanding has grasped the thought of the law itself, whereas previously it only looked for laws generally, and their moments were only vaguely present to it as specific content, sorry about that, but not as the thoughts of the laws. So what is he saying there? He's saying that something greater has come about, some sort of integration in which, because now we're talking about an organic unity, which involves, at least for human beings, right, consciousness, the understanding, now suddenly understanding has grasped the thought of the law. No longer just the content of the law or the multiplicity of laws, but it's actually, groping for, well, what the hell is law and why does it matter to me? It's broaching these larger, in certain respects, more fundamental or essential questions or issues. Now notice what he's going to say, though. He says, as regards content, the laws obtained here ought not to be such as are merely a passive taking up into the form of universality of simply inert differences, right? Just merely inert differences of content. We saw that merely inert differences can't grasp what's going on in the organic being either. How is this going to play out? He says, the laws which directly possess in these differences the unrest of the notion, the unrest, the not staying still, the dynamism is another way we could talk about it. Instead of talking about it in merely negative terms, unrest, unruhige, right, not being static, let's call it dynamic, let's call it what it is. This is what goes on with an organic being. it should be grasping the notion and at the same time possess the necessity of the relation between the object. So what is Hegel saying? If you're not grasping the notion, you're not actually grasping the necessity. Law is supposed to be about necessity, right? It's supposed to explain why things necessarily are the way that they are. So he goes on and he says, but because the object, the organic unity, directly, and here he's saying it's uniting things, right? It unites the infinite supersession, the Aufhebung, or absolute negation of being. What are we talking about there? Well, you know, the organic being is being, but it's being raised to a higher level. It's a negation of being insofar as it's not merely being, not merely static being, but a dynamic being that grows, that responds, that interacts, that develops complexity within it, that shows spontaneity to a certain extent, freedom to a certain extent. So all of these unites that with inert being. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It sounds as if now we're finally on the right track as far as this whole process of finding laws, which is what observing reason is all about, is doing. Now, notice how he closes the paragraph. He says, just because the object does all this, and because these moments are essentially a pure transition, there are no such inert aspects as are required for the law. So we have the thought of the law, and actually what are we losing? The content, right? The content is slipping out of our hands. Insofar as it is just inert differences, or inert contents, or inert whatever we want to say, it's no longer about the organic unity. Insofar as it's about the organic unity, it can no longer be expressed solely in those terms for us. Hegel's going to continue to explore this a bit more in the next paragraphs. In order to obtain such aspects, the understanding must keep to the other moment of the organic relationship, that is, to the reflectedness of organic existence into itself. But this being is so completely reflected into itself that there is no determinateness related to something else left over for it. Immediate, sensuous being is immediately one with the determinateness as such, and therefore expresses a qualitative difference in that being. For example, blue as against red, acid as against alkali, and so on. But organic being that is returned into itself is completely indifferent towards an other. Its existence is a simple universality, and it denies to observation any lasting sensuous differences, or what is the same thing, displays its essential determinateness only as the flux of inert determinatenesses. Consequently, the way in which difference, qua inert, expresses itself is just this, that it is an indifferent difference, that is, difference as magnitude. In this, however, the notion is extinguished and necessity has vanished. But then the content and filling of this indifferent being, the flux of sensuous determinations gathered up into an organic determination, expresses also this, that the content really does not have that determinateness, that is, that of the immediate property, and the qualitative element falls solely in the determination of magnitude, as we saw above. What's taking place in paragraph 280 can be a little bit difficult to follow. There's a lot of jumping back and forth that's happening, and I think it could be useful to chart it out like this so that we can see that there's actually a sort of a third thing being introduced here when we're contrasting the first two. Hegel's asking this question at the start, how can the understanding get these inert aspects? The inert aspects that in the previous paragraph he said just were not available for developing a law. Consciousness, observing reason, is still attempting to provide itself with some sort of law. It just, in the last paragraph brought back up the outer is the expression of the inner. It really wants to try to make that work. And so we're going to see another attempt at this. Hegel's going to contrast the notion of organic being against immediate sensuous being. And he says that in order to obtain these aspects, the understanding The understanding must keep to the other moment of the organic relationship. That is, to the reflectedness of organic existence into itself. So that is this side, the notion of organic being. And he says the problem with this is that this being is so reflected into itself that there really is no determinateness related to something else, like, for example, the understanding that's trying to make sense of it. And this is just, sort of the notion, I would say here in an abstract sense, not the notion as the living notion, the dynamic organic being embodying that, but what the understanding is making of it. He's saying here that, as we go towards the inner, and we look at, say, for example, those three expressions of the inner before sensibility, irritability, reproduction, we start to lose track because these are, in fact, a flux. They are, spread throughout the entire organism itself, the organic being, the existence of the organism. We start to lose hold on any inert moments that we could grab onto, almost as like, fixed points that then we could tie the law to. So he'll talk in terms of simple universality here. He'll also talk in terms of a flux of inert differences, which is going to lead us to that third part. Now, what is he contrasting against this? A little bit earlier in the paragraph, he talks about immediate sensuous being, what it is that we immediately perceive through the medium of our senses. Not to say that it's completely reducible to sense perception or, let alone just sensations that are occurring, but what is given to us. And he says that immediately it's determinatenesses that we're getting, right? This is presenting as this, right? And it's got qualities. Notice he talks about qualitative differences here. So he talks, for example, about not even complete opposites, like blue as against red, and then he talks about acid as against alkali. And he says, organic being that is returned to itself isn't this. It's this instead. And he goes on and he says, the way in which difference, qua inert, expresses itself is just this, that it is an indifferent difference. And we've seen this come up quite a lot. Hegel's going to make a move here that he's made at a number of points in the phenomenology so far, which is to say, what is indifferent difference? What is it to be different, but in a way that doesn't actually make a difference? The prime example of that is magnitude or quantity. So, moving from both sides, we're losing track, or we're losing what it is that we started out with in trying to get these aspects where we can talk in terms of the dynamic organic being, which can be understood, as he just said before, in terms of the notion. That, if we try to hold on to it, we wind up with these indifferent differences because all we have here is a flux of inert differences, right? Immediate sensuous being, insofar as it remains immediate sensuous being, is a matter of qualitative differences within this whole, booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James' term, determinatenesses. But insofar as we're making sense of it, we end up reducing it to its merely quantitative aspects. So he goes on and he says, in this, the notion is extinguished, right? We lose the necessity, if we're just dealing with this, we lose the necessity that we were after in the first place, and it's vanished. And he says the content and filling of this indifferent being, the flux of sensuous determinations gathered up into an organic determination, expresses this. The content does not really have that determinateness that is of the immediate property, and the qualitative element falls solely into the determination of magnitude. So we also are going to lose this. This is going to turn into magnitude. We're seeing everything sort of funneling into magnitude or quantity for the understanding. And this, we've seen this, technique or strategy carried out before, but now we're seeing it on a more global scale for the understanding. And the question is that actually going to be a successful strategy? Although then the objective aspect which is apprehended as an organic determinateness itself contains the notion and is thereby distinguished from the object as it presents itself to the understanding, which, in apprehending the content of its laws, behaves purely as perception, yet apprehension in the first case relapses completely into the principle and the manner of the understanding that merely perceives. For by so doing, what is apprehended receives the character of a fixed determinateness, the form of an immediate property or of an inert phenomenon. Furthermore, it is subsumed under the category of quantity, and the nature of the notion is suppressed. The exchange of an object that is merely perceived for one reflected into itself of a merely sensuous determinateness for an organic one thus loses once more its value, and does so by the fact that the understanding has not yet put behind it the formulating of laws. Hegel brings this line of criticism, or of reasoning, if you like, to a close in 281, paragraph 281. He's going to provide examples of this in paragraph 282, so he's just talking about the immediate conclusion, the form of what he's describing here. And he says, the objective aspect which is apprehended as an organic determinateness contains the notion. That's what the understanding is driving after in trying to formulate its laws, right? And as it's apprehending things under the framework of laws, it's hoping to do something different than actually is going to happen. It wants to take this as its object, but it ends up taking this. And this is, you might say, the reduced aspect, the hull, the husk, the shell of what this actually turns out to be. So he says, it's thereby distinguished, this organic determinateness, from the object as it presents itself to the understanding, which, as it's apprehending the content of through its laws, right, and of its laws, it behaves purely as perception. So understanding, in a certain sense, is doing something that it is familiar with. Remember that understanding, just like perception before it, was an Aufhebung. It was also a new Gestalt, a shape of consciousness, right? We have the lower shape that is taken up into the higher shape or higher activity. And in this case, understanding is not fully acting as understanding, you could say. It's reducing itself to perception. What is it that it does perceive then as it's apprehending the content of its laws? It perceives what Hegel calls fixed determinateness, right? And this might be in the form of an immediate property, which we saw could be qualitative, right? Or an inert phenomenon, something that presents itself and something we say, okay, I can work with this because it's going to stay still, right? If we want to use some examples just to try to drive this home before we get to the next paragraph, think about, as Hegel has talked about before, when we are working with a cadaver, when we're doing dissection, we're not actually working with the same thing as observation of a live being. I suppose you could say, well, what about vivisection? Well, that's pretty horrible stuff to begin with for a couple of things, but even that loses hold of it because you're changing just by imposing that kind of structure upon it. You're not observing it as it is within its environment, when somebody's not cutting it open with a scalpel, when somebody hasn't pinned it to a table, whatever else is going on. There's a kind of falsification of the reality of the organic thing that goes on in the attempt to be scientific and impose laws upon it. So that is something very important to keep in mind. Hegel says that what happens here is it behaves purely as perception, and apprehension in this case relapses completely into the principle and manner of the understanding that merely perceives. So, whereas perception should be a tool for understanding, you've got the tool driving the tool master, if you like that, right? Consciousness is kind of shifting itself into a lower but more manageable shape or activity. He says, by so doing, what is apprehended receives the character of fixed determinateness, right? So that's more malleable, but it's losing sight of it. It's subsumed under the category of quantity, and the nature of the notion is thereby suppressed in favor of quantity, because quantity is so manageable. So he goes on and he says, the exchange of an object that is merely perceived, right, for one that's reflected into itself, of a merely sensuous determinateness for an organic one, loses once more its value, and does so by the fact that the understanding is not put behind it, formulating laws. So what is that giving us the idea? Maybe this whole activity of formulating laws has been misguided, or at least the way in which it has been conceived by the understanding, the way in which it's been carrying out these laws has been misconceived and therefore has been a failure.